sailing ship tactics were the naval tactics employed by sailing ships in contrast to galley tactics employed by oared vessels. This article focuses on the period from c. 1500 to the mid-19th century, when sailing warships were replaced with steam-powered ironclads. Overview. Early history. Since ancient times, war at sea had been fought much like on land, with melee weapons and bows and arrows, but on floating wooden platforms rather than battlefields. Though the introduction of guns was a significant change, it only slowly changed the dynamics of ship-to-ship combat. The first guns on ships were small wrought iron pieces mounted on the open decks and in the fighting tops, often requiring only 1 or 2 men to handle them. They were designed to injure, kill, or simply stun, shock and frighten the enemy prior to boarding. As guns were made more durable to withstand stronger gunpowder charges, they increased the potential to inflict critical damage to the vessel rather than just its crew. Since these guns were much heavier than the earlier anti-personnel weapons, they had to be placed lower in the ships and fire from gun ports to avoid ships becoming unstable. In Northern Europe, the technique of building ships with clinker planking made it difficult to cut ports in the hull. Clinker-built ships had much of the structural strength in the outer hull. The solution was the gradual adoption of carvel-built ships that relied on an internal skeleton structure to bear the weight of the ship. The development of propulsion during the 15th century, from single-masted, square-rigged cogs to 3-masted carracks with a mix of square and lateen sails, made ships nimbler and easier to maneuver. Gun ports cut in the hull of ships had been introduced as early as 1501. According to tradition, the inventor was a Breton shipwright called discharges, but it is just as likely to have been a gradual adaptation of loading ports in the stern of merchant vessels that had already been in use for centuries. Initially, the gun ports were used to mount heavy so-called stern chases pointing aft, but soon gun ports migrated to the sides of ships. This made possible coordinated volleys from all the guns on one side of a ship, broadsides, for the first time in history, at least in theory. Guns in the 16th century were considered to be in fixed positions and were intended to be fired independently rather than in concerted volleys. It was not until the 1590s that the word broadside in English was commonly used to refer to gunfire from the side of a ship rather than the ship's side itself. Naval tactics throughout the 16th century and well into the 17th century, however, was focused on countering the oar-powered galleys that were armed with heavy guns in the bow, facing forwards, which were aimed by turning the entire ship against its target. Though far less seaworthy than sailing vessels and highly vulnerable to boarding by ships that rode higher in the water, the galleys were a serious threat due to their ability to aim accurate heavy gunfire low in the hulls of larger sailing ships and to escape early sail-powered opponents by rowing into the wind. Initial tactics. The line of battle tactic that allowed efficient use of broadside fire was not put into general use until the late 17th century. The interim solution was to make sailing ships fire backwards from the stern as a defensive measure, or forward from the bow as an offensive measure. The latter was only partially achieved either by canting the side guns towards the bow's stern as far as the ship's structure would allow, or to place guns on the stern castle and fire them in an arc on either side of the forecastle. Both solutions were problematic since they created a blind spot dead ahead and made it especially difficult to hit low-lying targets, like galleys. The method that was deemed most effective alternative by contemporaries was to simply counter the threat of galleys with other galleys. Despite the technical innovations, naval cannon fire also remained grossly inaccurate except at very close ranges. Difficulties in achieving standardization in metallurgy meant that all guns allowed for considerable windage, meaning that bore diameters were about 10% larger than their ammunition. Combined with inefficient gunpowder and the difficulties inherent in firing accurately from moving platforms meant that naval tactics for sailing ships throughout the 16th century remained focused on boarding as a means of decisive victory. Naval tactics in the Age of Sail were primarily determined by the sailing and fighting qualities of the sailing warships of the time. Three factors, in particular, constrained what a sailing admiral could order his fleet to do. The first constraint was that, like all sailing vessels, sailing warships could not sail directly into the wind. Most could sail not much closer than 70 degrees off the wind. This limited the maneuverability of a fleet during battles at close quarters. Holding the weather gauge, i.e., being upwind of one's opponent, conferred considerable tactical advantages. The second constraint was that the ships of the time carried the guns in two large batteries, one on each broadside, with only a few mounted to fire directly ahead or astern. The sailing warship was immensely powerful on its sides, but very weak on its bow and stern. The sides of the ship were built with strong timbers, but the stern, in particular, was fragile, with a flimsy structure around the large windows of the officers' cabins. The bows, and particularly the sterns of the ship, were vulnerable to raking fire. Raking another ship by firing the length of a ship from either the bow or stern caused tremendous damage, because a single shot would fly down the length of the decks, while the ship being raked could not return fire with its broadsides. The third constraint was the difficulty of communicating at sea. Written communication was almost impossible in a moving fleet, while hailing was extremely difficult above the noise of wind and weather. So admirals were forced to rely on a pre-arranged set of signal flags hoisted aboard the admiral's flagship. In the smoke of battle, these were often hard or impossible to see. The 16th century saw the development of the man-of-war, a truly ocean-going warship, carrying square-rigged sails that permitted tacking into the wind, and heavily armed with cannon. The adoption of heavy guns necessitated the being mounted lower down than on top of the fore and after castles as previously, where anti-personnel weapons had been positioned through the later Middle Ages, due to the possibility of capsizing. This meant that what had earlier been the hold of a ship that could be used either as a merchant ship or warship was now full with cannon and ammunition. Hence, ships became specialized as warships, which would lead to a standing fleet instead of one based on placing temporary contracts. The man-of-war eventually rendered the galley obsolete except for operations close to shore in calm weather. With the development of the sailing man-of-war, and the beginning of the great sailing fleets capable of keeping at sea for long periods together, came the need for a new adaptation of old principles of naval tactics. A ship which depended on the wind for its motive power could not hope to ram. A sailing vessel could not ram unless it was running before a good breeze. In a light wind, the charge would be ineffective, and it could not be made at all from leeward. It could still board, and the Spanish did for long make it the main object to run the bow over an enemy's sides and invade the deck. In order to carry out this kind of attack, they would naturally try to get to windward and then bear down before the wind in line abreast, ship upon ship. But an opponent to leeward could always baffle this attack by edging away, and in the meantime fire with his broadside to cripple his opponent's spars. An important organizational innovation was made by Sir Francis Drake. Prior to his leadership, a warship was typically run by a committee of the sailing master, navigator, master gunner and captain of marines, presided over by an aristocrat. Drake saw no purpose in having a member of the aristocracy without specialist knowledge and established the principle that the captain of the ship would be in sole command, based upon his skill and experience rather than social position. This transformation was never quite made in the Spanish Navy, where the gentlemen continued to obstruct operations throughout the Age of Sail. The revolutionary French Navy made an opposite mistake in promoting seamen without sufficient experience and training, which worked well in the army, but not at sea. The Royal Navy, by contrast, was well served by many distinguished commanders of middle-class origin, such as Horatio Nelson, Jervis Collingwood, as well as by aristocrats who proved themselves at sea, such as Thomas Cochrane, and even members of the working class, such as John Benbow. Line of battle. The first recorded mention of the use of a line of battle tactic is attested from 1500. The instructions provided in 1500 by King Manuel I of Portugal to the commander of a fleet dispatched to the Indian Ocean suggests its use predated the written instructions. Portuguese fleets overseas deployed in line ahead, firing one broadside and then putting about in order to return and discharge the other, resolving battles by gunnery alone. In a treatise of 1555, The Art of War at Sea, Portuguese theorist on naval warfare and shipbuilding, Fernão de Oliveira, recognized that at sea, the Portuguese fight at a distance, as if from walls and fortresses. He recommended the single line ahead as the ideal combat formation. An early line of battle tactic had been used by the 4th Portuguese India Armada in the Battle of Calicut, under Vasco da Gama in 1502, near Malabar, against a Muslim fleet. One of the earliest recorded deliberate use is also documented in the First Battle of Cananor between the 3rd Portuguese India Armada under João da Nova and the naval forces of Calicut, earlier in the same year. This early use of this strategy also consisted in its implementation, in both battles, on only one side of the contenders. The evolution of naval cannons during the first half of the 17th century soon led to the conclusion that the fleet had to fight in a single line to make the maximum use of its firepower without one ship getting in the way of another. The line of battle was traditionally attributed to the Navy of the Commonwealth of England, and especially to General at Sea Robert Blake, who wrote the Sailing and Fighting Instructions of 1653. One of the first documented deliberate use seems to be somewhat earlier, in the action of the 18th of September, 1639 by Dutch Lieutenant Admiral Martin Tromp against the Spanish. The tactic was used by both sides in the Anglo-Dutch Wars, and was codified in written fighting instructions. These formed the basis of the whole tactical system of the 17th and 18th centuries in naval warfare. One consequence of the line of battle was that a ship had to be strong enough to stand in it. In the old type of melee battle, a small ship could seek out an opponent of her own size, or combine with others to attack a larger one. As the line of battle was adopted, navies began to distinguish between vessels that were fit to form parts of the line in action, and the smaller ships that were not. By the time the line of battle was firmly established as the standard tactical formation during the 1660s, merchant ships and lighter armed warships became less able to sustain the place in a pitched battle. In the line of battle, each ship had to stand and fight the opposing ship in the enemy line, however powerful she might be. The purpose-built ships powerful enough to stand in the line of battle came to be known as a ship of the line. Importance of the weather gauge. Holding the weather, or windward, gauge conferred several important tactical advantages. The admiral holding the weather gauge held the tactical initiative, able to accept battle by bearing down on his opponent or to refuse it by remaining upwind. The fleet with the lee gauge could avoid battle by withdrawing to leeward but could not force action. Even retreating downwind could be difficult once two fleets were at close quarters because the ships risked being raked as they turned downwind. A second disadvantage of the leeward gauge was that in anything more than a light wind, a sailing ship that is sailing close-hauled will heel to leeward under the pressure of the wind on its sails. The ships of the fleet on the leeward gauge heel away from their opponents, exposing part of the bottoms to shot. If a ship is penetrated in an area of the hull that is normally under water, she is then in danger of taking on water or even sinking when on the other tack. This is known as hulled between wind and water. Finally, smoke from the gunfire of the ships to windward would blow down on the fleet on the leeward gauge. So it was common for battles to involve days of maneuvering as one admiral strove to take the weather gauge from his opponent in order to force him to action, as at the battles of Ushant, St. Lucia Channel and the 1st of June. Only in heavy weather could the windward gauge become a disadvantage, because the lower gun ports on the leeward side of a ship would be awash, preventing her from opening her lower deck ports to use the guns, or risking being swamped if she did. So, in strong winds, a ship attacking from windward would not be able to bring her heavy lower deck guns into action, while the enemy ship to leeward would have no such problem, as the guns on her windward side would be raised by the heel. For this reason, Admiral Rodney ordered his ships to attack the Spanish from leeward in the stormy weather at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent in 1780. Development of tactics in the French Navy. In the French Navy, sailing tactics were developed by the treatises of the French tacticians Paul Hoste, Bigot de Marogues and Bourg de Villehuet, which developed the traditional code of practice and were all translated into other languages. During the 18th century, French governments developed the strategic doctrine of focusing on the mission, rather than fighting for command of the sea. The French government was often reluctant to take tactical risks to achieve its strategic objectives. The navy was hampered by the timidity of its orders. French fleets and squadrons typically sought to avoid battle rather than risk a contest with a British force, as de Tournay did in June 1780 on meeting a smaller British squadron under Cornwallis off Bermuda. This strategy had important tactical ramifications. French ships tended to fire at the rigging of their opponents to disable them and allow the French ships to escape and continue with the mission. French ships typically fired at broadsides on the upward roll of the ship, disabling their opponents but doing little damage to the enemy ships of the crews. This was compounded by the French tendency to fight from the leeward gauge, causing the guns to point high as the ships heeled with the wind. British and Dutch ships, by contrast, tended to use the opposite tactic of firing on the downward roll into the enemy hulls, causing a storm of flying splinters that killed and maimed the enemy gun crews. This difference in tactics goes some way to explaining the difference in casualty figures between British and French crews, with French fleets tending to suffer not only more casualties but also a higher proportion of killed than wounded. Tactical stagnation in the mid-18th century. When the conflict came to be between the British and the French in the 18th century, battles between equal or approximately equal forces became largely inconclusive. The French, who had fewer ships than the British throughout the century, were anxious to fight at the least possible cost, lest the fleet should be worn out by severe action, leaving Britain with an unreachable numerical superiority. superiority. Therefore, they preferred to engage to leeward, a position which left them free to retreat before the wind. They allowed the British fleet to get to windward, and, when it was parallel with them and bore up before the wind to attack, they moved onwards. The attacking fleet had then to advance, not directly before the wind with its ships moving along lines perpendicular to the line attack, but in slanting or curving lines. The assailants would be thrown into a bow and quarter line, with the bow of the second level with the after part of the first, and so on from end to end. In the case of a number of ships of various powers of sailing, it was a difficult formation to maintain. The result was often that the ships of the attacking line which were steering to attack the enemy's center came into action first and were liable to be crippled in the rigging. If the same formation was to be maintained, the others were now limited to the speed of the injured vessels, and the enemy to leeward slipped away. At all times a fleet advancing from windward was liable to injury in spars, even if the leeward fleet did not deliberately aim at them. The leeward ships would be leaning away from the wind, and the shot would always have a tendency to fly high. So long as the assailant remained to windward, the ships to leeward could always slip off. The wars of the 18th century produced a series of tactically indecisive naval battles between evenly matched fleets in line ahead, such as Malaga, Rugen Island, Toulon, Minorca, Negapatam, Cuddalore, Pondicherry, Ushant, Dogger Bank, the Chesapeake, Hogland and Oland. Although a few of these battles had important strategic consequences, like the Chesapeake, which the British needed to win, all were tactically indecisive. Many admirals began to believe that a contest between two equally matched fleets could not produce a decisive result. The tactically decisive actions of the 18th century were all chase actions, where one fleet was clearly superior to the other, such as the two battles of Finisterre and those at Lagos, Quiberon Bay and Cape St. Vincent. British naval innovation was retarded by an unseemly dispute between two admirals in the aftermath of the Battle of Toulon. The British fleet under Admiral Thomas Matthews had been unable to draw level with the French fleet, but Matthews nevertheless ordered an attack, intending all the British ships to attack the French rear. He had no signals by which he could communicate his intentions, and the rear squadron under Vice Admiral Richard Lestock, his rival and second in command, obtusely remained at the prescribed intervals in line ahead, far to the rear of the action. A subsequent series of courts-martial, in which political influence was brought to bear by Lestock's friends in Parliament, punished Matthews and those captains who had supported him in the battle, and vindicated Lestock. In several future actions, admirals who were tempted to deviate from the Admiralty's fighting instructions were reminded of Matthews's fate. Developments during the American War of Independence. The unsatisfactory character of the accepted method of fighting battles at sea had begun to be obvious to naval officers, both French and British, by the later 18th century, and began to be addressed during the numerous battles of the American War of Independence. It was clear that the only way to produce decisive results was to concentrate the attack on part of the enemy's line, preferably the rear, since the center would have to turn to its support. The great French Admiral Suffren condemned naval tactics as being little better than so many excuses for avoiding a real fight. He endeavored to find a better method, by concentrating superior forces on parts of his opponent's line in some of his actions with the British fleet in the East Indies in 1782 and 1783, such as the Battle of Sadras, where Suffren tried to double the rear of the British line, but his orders were ill-obeyed. His opponent, Sir Edward Hughes, was competent, and the quality of his fleet was not superior to the British. Similarly, the British Admiral Rodney Rodney, in the Battle of Martinique in the West Indies in 1780, tried to concentrate a superior force on part of his enemy's line by throwing a greater number of British ships on the rear of the French line, but his directions were misunderstood and not properly executed. Moreover, he did not then go beyond trying to place a larger number of ships in action to windward against a smaller number to leeward by ranging them at a less distance than 2 cables' length. An enemy who took the simple and obvious course of closing his line could baffle the attack, and while the retreat to leeward remained open could still slip away. Like Suffren, Rodney was a great tactician, but a difficult man to work with who failed to explain his intentions to his subordinates. At the Battle of the Saints on the 12th of April 1782, Rodney was induced, by a change in the wind and the resulting disorder in the French line, to break his own line and pass through the enemy line. The effect was decisive. The guns of the British ships were concentrated on a handful of French ships as the British broke through the French line in 3 places, and the tactical cohesion of the French fleet was destroyed. By the end of the battle, Rodney had taken the French flagship and 4 other ships. The successful result of this departure from the old practice of keeping the line intact throughout the battle ruined the moral authority of the orthodox system of tactics. Sir John Clarke of Eldon. The inconclusive results of so many battles at sea interested Sir John Clarke of Eldon, a gentleman of the Scottish Enlightenment, illustrator of geologist James Hutton's theory of the Earth, and great-uncle of James Clerk Maxwell. He began developing a series of speculations and calculations which he initially published in pamphlets, distributing them among naval officers, and published in book form as an essay on naval tactics in 1790, 1797 and 1804. The hypothesis which governed all of Clarke's demonstrations was that as the British Navy was superior in gunnery and seamanship to their enemy, it was in their interest to produce a melee. He advanced various ingenious suggestions for concentrating superior forces on parts of the enemy's line, by preference on the rear, since the centre must lose time in turning to its support.